Good morning, Mary, if you hear us. Good evening to Professor Tu, and good afternoon to the other two speakers, Ambassador Zhang and Dr. Weinian Hu. So we would begin with this session. There is quite some variation in the themes of this session, and that's good because the EU-US-China trade and investment relations have become extremely rich and varied. And in all of those aspects, they have also become important to the three players, but also important to the rest of the world. And in many ways. So on the one hand, we try to cover a lot with the four speakers, but there is just no hope that everything can be covered fully in 1.5 hours. That is not possible. Still, I think that we could make this a lively and an interesting session. My proposal is that first Professor Tu Xinquan will speak. He has several contributions in the RESPECT project, this big RESPECT project that goes over various continents and is led actually by Bernard Hoekman. And the contributions from Professor Tu and his colleagues are on the China side, of course, and we're very happy that we in Europe in that RESPECT project are not only writing about China from European or other perspective, but also from a Chinese perspective. And he will therefore begin, followed by Weinian Hu, who will look more at what Europe and China have done from the European end, but also we weave in a bit of US things on some specific aspects that she masters very well. Then I would love to give the floor to Ambassador Zhang, Ambassador for China to the WTO, who I think doesn't need any further introduction, and we're very, very keen to hear you, what you have to say. And then finally, Mary Lovely, who is still somehow getting in touch or getting up. So, Xinquan, why don't you take the floor, and I'll clock you for 13, 14 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so you don't support sharing the screen?
Oh,
you can share screen.
But I can do that. Let me try again. No, I was.
So Monique, can you get?
I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed.
Yes, we are. Just 1 second.
Because you have slides, no?
Yeah, I have some. Okay, now it's working. Okay. Thank you, Jacques. Thank you, Bernard. I'm very honored to be a participant of this forum and also this RESPECT program. I will actually, we have 2 papers, but since this is a forum, so I think I will focus more on the first paper. It's about China's trade policy toward the EU, or its Chinese perspective on the EU-China trade relations. So it's co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Liz Ji. So mainly 3 parts. The first one is the background of China's EU policy. Second is the characteristics of China's EU policy, trade policy, okay. Prospects of China's EU trade policy. So one major background right now is the rising importance of China-EU relations, given the current global uncertainties and the US retreat from multilateral affairs. Actually, in China, there is a very, very strong consensus that the EU right now is very, very important, or much more important than before. That in this under this current situation, because the US seems to be determined to take China as an opponent or a rivalry. So China and Europe, EU are very supportive of multilateralism. So China and EU could work close to fight with unilateralism and protectionism. So actually, as I said, there is very strong consensus inside China that we should cooperate with the EU to support multilateralism and to fight with this kind of unilateralism. Under different, under various schemes, including the WTO reform and also the BRI, climate change, right now, like the fight with the pandemic. So we believe that the cooperation between China and Europe are very important for China, but also for the world. There are important features of the overall relationship between China and the outside world, such as increasing interdependence, and coexisting cooperation and competition. It is also very evident in China-EU trade and economic relations. So how to position and develop China-EU trade and economic relation is a major issue, or it's a very big challenge, I think, for China's overall diplomatic agenda. Because one important reason is the EU has its own perception and approaches toward China. There are some disparities between the two sides. So I think now maybe the most needed thing is the mutual trust or mutual understanding between EU and China. Concerns arise within the EU on the lack of consistency and coherence in the foreign policy toward China. Like recently, Czech Republic's senior official visited Taiwan, causing a serious trouble between China and Europe. So there are some uncertainties. So for China, it is also difficult, I mean, to deal with an EU consisting of 27 nation states, representing sometimes very divergent short and longer term national interests. So as I said, the case of Czech's visit to Taiwan is a very good example. And on the China side, we have some findings, or if I find some conclusions of characteristics of China's trade policy towards the EU. First, it is a multi-objective. It has multiple objectives to cooperate with the EU. The first one is economic considerations. For sure, EU is a very important economic partner in terms of trade, investment, technology, financial, energy, and sustainable development. So for China, it is in our very important economic interest to cooperate with EU on all these issues, because the EU is so huge and diversified economic entity. And also, of course, the EU is leading in many areas, such as as I said, climate change and also technological development. Then second objective is for strategic considerations. Actually, as I said, it is even more important under the current situation when the US-China relationship is getting more difficult. So a strong European integration would fit into the baseline strategy of China about the multipolar global order. So China and the EU all believe in multilateralism. So we believe that the cooperation between two sides could promote bilateral economic, political, and diplomatic relations through constructive engagement and cooperation in a broader agenda of solving global crisis. The third characteristic is it is a multi dimensional, which means that China is exploring new ways of cooperation in accordance with different characteristics of the EU as a whole, as the geographical European sub-regions and the individual EU member states, where each complementing another and advancing together. But sometimes it also has some conflicts, probably, or it will create some different perceptions in the EU. So at the EU level, China released 3 China's EU policy papers in 2003, 2014, and 2018. So we can have a look at the basic structure. All these papers cover a lot of very wide range of issues. So on economic, on environmental cooperation, and other issues. Sorry. And also, China is trying to develop cooperation with sub-regions of Europe, especially the 17+1 platform, which is a voluntary and open platform. But as I said, this cooperation created some concerns in the EU. But in my own opinion, I think this kind of program is just to develop economic cooperation with these countries, because we believe that these countries could provide more opportunities, especially for Chinese investments, and also because they are less developed than other European EU countries, EU members. So they have more development space. So we want to develop a deeper cooperation with these countries under the framework of BRI, but it is not conflicting with our cooperation with the EU as a whole. And also we are trying to develop deeper relations with individual EU member states, especially some major countries like Germany, France, UK. Oh no, okay, sorry, UK is not EU member anymore. And Netherlands and Italy, both from economic and strategic purposes. Like you see, Germany is running the largest trade surplus with China, while the Netherlands is having the largest trade deficit with China. And also, like Germany, Netherlands, or Italy are all major investment partners with China. The fourth one is as multi-approach. We establish institutional settings and the treaty basis for matters in fields of economics, investment, trade, and science and technology. But at the same time, we apply soft law approach to matters in the fields of like environment, labor standard, enterprise social responsibility. So on these issues, we believe that voluntarity is more important or more efficient to deal with these issues or to cooperate with each other. But lastly, there, as I said, there are some challenges. Short-term challenges, the growing skepticism, and worries in Europe about China's outward FDI. Maybe not only FDI, but also some other issues, like BRI. The second one, the medium-term challenges, efforts by EU together with other developed countries, US and Japan, to discipline the industrial subsidies and SOEs with China in mind. I think on these issues, we have kind of different ideas, different understandings. And the longer-term challenge is to position its role in regional and global economic governance. I think it's also a big challenge for us to self-position China, whether China is a developing country or not, or whether this so-called reciprocity should apply between China and the EU or between China and other developed countries. it's a big issue, I think, in China also. For the future, I think we have basically 3 focuses. These are actually ongoing. First one, China will make efforts to secure the successful conclusion of a comprehensive investment agreement between China and the EU. The 2 governments just had a new negotiation. Second, China will make efforts to expand cooperation between the 2 sides in regional development in the pursuit of synergies between BRI and the relevant EU strategies. I think we don't want to cause any trouble to the EU. Third, China will make efforts to strengthen strategic partnership with the EU toward shared global responsibility, especially, I think, in the fields of WTO reform and climate change governance. So, in general, I think, especially the pandemic created some problems, but I think it will bring some opportunities for the 2 sides to cooperate. But one maybe basis is mutual understanding and mutual trust. As I said, from our perspective, we never want to bring trouble to the EU, especially the EU members' relationship. In our understanding, I think it's a domestic issue. And we never try to intervene in other countries, other organizations in a domestic issue. So, okay, I think I should stop here. Thank you. This is another paper. I don't want to take more time.
Yeah, that is the paper for respect, at least.
Yeah.
And maybe in another setting we
Yes.
can discuss this because the theme is very interesting. Well, thank you very much. And you stuck to 13.5 minutes. So my compliment. We now go to Weinian Hu, who will actually give a bit of an overview with some emphasis on very specific IPR issues and with a little bit of the US. And I think it's a very nice introduction for the broader debate. Weinian, you have the floor.
You should unmute your microphone.
Me?
Hello again. Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this Global Trade Forum. And I'm also very pleased that this presentation follows very strictly Bethna's instruction on how this panel should be run. So the presentation will be divided into 2 parts. First of all, on what has been happening, and secondly, on what dialogues have served. So on EU-China dialogue, this is a subject that we studied very extensively in the framework of our Respect project. But nonetheless, we must bear in mind that China-US also have dialogues also on non-trade issues, although those dialogues are suspended since 2018. So I will start by talking about Guy. Just now, Xinquan also mentioned why starting from Guy, because the Guy summarizes what's been happening, EU-China and the EU-US, China-US, and also China itself. The Guy could also tell what will be happening in future. And moreover, these days, a very favorite game in Brussels is to guess if ever Guy will be concluded by the end of the year. And now the success of Guy's conclusion may be facilitated by the China Foreign Investment Law, as well as the Phase 1 agreement. However, the Guy's conclusion may also be impeded by the Phase 1. I will tell later. So what dialogues have served? those outstanding issues that dialogues can help to solve or help to facilitate to solve. In my presentation, the focus will be on trade dialogues. For example, under GUI, one question is on subsidies transparency. And actually, I read Ambassador Zhang's paper last year on capacity constraint, published by the Journal of World Trade. And I will also touch upon 3 commercial and trade dialogues conducted by the US and China. And lastly, I will give a short, very short example on the 3 parties' cooperation on geographical indications. So on GUI, what's happening and what's going to happen, we can tell from the primary objectives. So it's on market access, on a number of WTO disciplines, including first the technology transfer and investment related to sustainable development goals. And those are the dialogues actually, also we call it non-trade policy objectives. That's where we say, usually we say that's where the EU's soft power may exercise. However, we ask a question on this part. And then the guy that what the Chinese investors want to achieve vis-a-vis the EU. And we hear that Chinese investors' confidence is declining. This is also vis-a-vis all those instruments under review or already implemented. The screening, investment screening will be in October, and other those instruments. That's what the Chinese investors are worried about. And one outstanding one outstanding question between Chinese investors against the EU is that Chinese investors often complain that the EU single market looks very open. However, if you go deeper, and many small doors are closed, and besides, there's no harmonization. And as I just now mentioned about the guessing game, I think that the Chinese foreign investment law could facilitate the EU achieve a number of objectives in its GUI negotiations. I highlighted here on national treatment, negative list, and also on forced technology transfer. And forced technology transfer actually is a question of 2 parts. One is on market access, another is on IPR protection. So I see that those complaints that are in the EU's WTO complaint are actually lots of them are addressed by the foreign investment law. And by the way, including government procurement activities. And we see that, for example, Ericsson in April obtained its second license to for China's 5G infrastructure. And the next is again on forced technology transfer. I mentioned just now another part of forced technology transfer is IPR technology transfer contractual provisions. And so it's not that China doesn't pay. China is one of the highest payers in the world on licensing fees, on royalties. However, it's also about freedom to contract, and also about to safeguard IPR holders' exclusive rights to exploit. and then trade secrets. And I would like to draw your attention that lots of those provisions coincide with the US-China Phase 1 agreement. So here, and the Phase 1 agreement could also facilitate the EU to achieve, for example, on pharma-related patent protection. And on this, on patent examination, pharma patent applications examination, patent term extensions, and because of this Phase 1, China's patent law is under amendment again in January in order to implement all those provisions, also on technology transfer. And under the Phase 1, also China pledged not to support outbound FDI, not to target those foreign technology sectors that are in China's industrial plans, and also on IPR protection. One complaint, because in China, the IPR enforcement is under two streams. One is administrative, another is legal. So, and often heard the complaint is that the criminal law enforcement threshold was too high. So it's also lowered. However, the US-China Phase 1 could impede the EU on GI, although I must admit that the GI is not in Gai, but nonetheless, GI is very important to the EU, not only because of China is the EU's second biggest food market, and so to the US as well. However, it's those two restrictions set down by the Phase 1 agreement on GI are not a surprise either. Why? Because those consultation in the EU-China GI agreement, China also agreed to the EU that China will consult the EU first if to recognize any GI names under an international agreement. And so on these two parts, actually, they are already achieved by the US-China trade dialogues over the years. But the biggest problem is financial services, because the financial services opening up under the Phase 1 is on a reciprocity basis, so not to anybody else. And this could be a very sticking point for EU-China Gai, also on financial services. And we already heard that the EU said that it must have at least the same concessions as they see from the Phase 1. So lots of opening up and remove the equity cap that's beyond the China's GATS obligation. Also on e-payment on life insurance, pension. So all this, it's a great opening up to the US financial services. Now, what dialogue could achieve? So dialogue could prepare China, the EU, to do lots of behind the scene work before they could cement an agreement on very precise provisions. This is a complete EU-China dialogue architecture. So it's under 3 pillars: political, trade, and people-to-people. By the way, people-to-people dialogue, the US-China also have. And then chapeau is the strategic dialogue. And the interlocutors, so dialogues are also conducted at different levels. And one IPR dialogue, and since 2004, I see this IPR dialogue depicts how EU-China conduct their dialogues apart from political level for impetus, and also at a working party level, and also deliverables which are contractual. And a very successful IPR dialogue is on EU-China cooperation on GI. So basically, from zero, EU installed this GI system in China, and it's still ongoing, and lots of technical difficulties as well. Law to enact a new law, to amend the trademark law, to introduce a new registration system. And but it's a good thing, because in China, lots of poor regions are actually GI rich. So this now it's also Chinese authorities also promote a lot on GI growth and GI production. But the cooperation is ongoing, because there will be more GIs to be protected in China and in the EU. And so on non-trade issues against the CII, we see there are two. One is employment, so labor protection standards, and the environment. And however, we are talking about a soft power, but we actually, our research is still ongoing, but at this moment, actually, we doubt we can say that this is the EU's value, because that's one thing EU promotes a lot since 2015. All the trade agreements must be EU value based. Why we have doubts here? Because after all, this employment, better labor protection, these are fundamental ILO fundamental conventions. And on environment dialogue, why that time EU-China initiated this environmental dialogue? That was to implement the UN agenda for sustainable development. So we don't know if EU can claim that it's their value, but a very good thing about this non-trade issues dialogue is that although it started not as a trade opportunity, but now they turn this environmental dialogue as a trade opportunities, because this we must thank the EU, because the EU introduced lots of policies. Also, EU implemented a very specific project to raise people's awareness of environmental protection. So we have there, and now I turn to this US-China dialogue on trade and non-trade issues. So US and China have 3 dialogues. They are more straightforward. So commerce and the USTR, and then treasury. Under the treasury, they also conduct non-trade issue dialogues. And also people to people, we see that climate change, energy, social safety net, strengthen medical pension benefits for all residents, universal social security coverage. Also, one important thing under pharmaceutical cooperation is that, of course, the US pharma industry is very strong, but still they try to ask Chinese authorities to open more reimbursable list. So more medical medicines can be reimbursed under the social security system.
Weinian,
yes.
Come to a close, because you're already a little bit over time.
Sorry, so I want to, here I give a list of what the US has achieved under dialogue on GI, and all these are implemented in the EU-China GI. And so lastly, I answer this question, what dialogues have served?
Yeah.
So I stop here. You can read, I can answer questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Weinian. It was a pretty full meal, that we had to consume, and we are still digesting it. But I have to watch a bit the time. That's my main duty. And I'm happy and feel privileged to give now the floor to Ambassador Zhang, and you can speak from now.
Okay, thank you, Jacques. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in today's panel. And I also want to thank Bernard to organize this forum. I also want to thank Xiangchen and Ms. Hu for your insightful presentation. And I think today's topic is an important one. The United States and the European Union and China are the three largest economies, the three big elephants in the world, account for 59.3% of the world economy and 42% of the international trade and 46.2% of the global FDIs. That's why the bilateral relations among the three are the most important ties, which have a direct impact on the stability and the prosperity of the world. In the past, we often use the term bolster to describe the economic and trade exchange between economies. I fully agree with the analogy, even as of today, because compared with other elements in bilateral relations, such as politics, military power, human rights, so on and so forth, trade is quite unique. It can be negotiated through give and take process to achieve mutually acceptable outcomes. Currently, we see the trade tensions between China and the US, as well as difficulties in the Sino-EU trade relations. But we can't jump to conclusion that the bilateral trade between the two is a bad idea. Rather, it shows that their trade relation is more complicated than before, which requires more caution and a deeper thinking of deal with. Simply expecting the relationship to go back to normal or resulting to decoupling is not the way out. To be honest, back in 1980s, we were very nervous in the negotiations of the resumption of China's contracting party status in GATT, and subsequently the accession to the WTO. It was the United States and the European Union, the driving force of economic globalization at that time, who spared no efforts in encouraging us and other developing countries to integrate into the globalization. We finally decided to do so, while very much reluctant to use the word integrate. Integrate in Chinese literally means the possibility of losing yourself in the tide of globalization. At that time, I called this decision to be carried along by the waves. It was a dilemma for us. If one doesn't advance with the trend, it's possible to become obsolete. At the same time, tremendous risk will be there, waiting along the path of integration. Decades have passed, and the decision is proven to be the right one. China has benefited from the globalization and achieved a rapid development. However, it is also noted that structural problems have emerged in the process of globalization, particularly in the developed world. The unequal distribution of wealth has become an increasingly serious problem. Lacking effective adjustment, we are witnessing more and more dissatisfaction in the society, causing waves of anti-globalization sentiment. As a result, politicians strive to find a scapegoat to divert the attention of their constituency. And the foreign trading partners are the easy target. That is why the so-called China problem arises. Although globalization and technological advancement have led to great changes in the international division of labor and a comparative advantage, China is still at the middle low end of the global value chain. Multinational companies of developed countries are still the biggest beneficiaries of globalization. To accuse China of intellectual property theft and taking away jobs can't solve the structural problem within the United States. To impose tariff on Chinese products worthy of hundreds of billions of dollars has not reduced the US trade deficit. To the contrary, the US trade deficit with China reached $34.2 billion last month, the highest level since November 2018, when the trade conflict ramped up. I think the power of market is irresistible in economic and trade relations, no matter how big or small the economies are. In a highly interdependent era, to advocate national first or make it here not only runs against the market rules, but also unpractical. The commercial presence and the industry chain shaped by the economic globalization should be respected instead of altered by force through administrative orders. We noted that even facing the risk of decoupling by force, the 2020 China Business Report by American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai shows that 78.6% of 346 interviewed US companies have no plans of restructuring their investment in China. It's recorded an increase of 5.1% compared with the figure in 2019's report. A survey conducted by the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China this February also shows that most member companies plan to maintain their investment in China, while only 11% of them would consider replanning, which was the lowest rate in the past decade. With difference emerged in cooperation, multilateral rules are particularly important. And the primary benchmark to manage the difference and strengthen cooperation is the WTO rules. On September 15th, the WTO published its ruling of the US Section 301 tariff on Chinese imports, finding that the measures imposed by the US are inconsistent with the WTO rules. Some may say that the ruling is no more than a piece of paper due to the paralysis of the appellate body. If that was the case, how can we explain the strong reaction from the other side? In my view, it's quite the opposite. The ruling is more precious than ever. Against the backdrop of ranging trade protectionism, the panel of this case made an objective and a fair ruling. And a tremendous pressure. It's a victory of justice. It's a legally authoritative ruling by the WTO on an obvious issue, which everybody can easily tell is inconsistency with the multilateral rules. The appellate body will resume function, and the unilateral tariff will ultimately be terminated. I'm willing to bet anyone on this. Having said that, I believe that the foundation of the Sino-US economic and trade cooperation is still there. From the perspective of China, this foundation is a huge market with great potential and a continuous liberalization. Both Xinquan and Ms. Hu mentioned the opening plan of China. Actually, at this point of time, China is accelerating its opening up in different areas, including auto market, the financial services, the energy sector, and the market access of foreign investment. The Beijing International Fair for Trading Services and the Xiamen International Fair for Investment and Trade successfully held earlier this month. And the China International Import-Export to be held this November provide useful platform for business both in China and the US to cooperate. Moreover, in response to the COVID-19, the cooperation between the US and China, especially with regard to the medical products and medical services, is of great significance to help countries around the world to defeat the pandemic as soon as possible, especially for those vulnerable ones. It's a pity that some of the existing mechanisms for economic and trade dialogues between China and the US have been paralyzed. When I was in Beijing, there were great efforts to promote sub-federal level cooperation between the two countries by establishing many working groups. It's good to see that those working groups are still active, continuing to strengthen the foundation of economic cooperation between the two countries. On Sino-EU trade relationship, I think there is a sound foundation for bilateral economic cooperation between China and the EU. Both sides are strong supporters of multilateral trading system, sharing the same objectives and similar views in responding to global challenges, advancing WTO reforms, restoring the apple body, promoting joint statement initiatives, including e-commerce and investment facilitation, and enhancing transparency. The two of us should work together to get the WTO out of the current crisis as soon as possible. In the bilateral front, the two sides signed a landmark geographic indication agreement last week. Ms. Hu just mentioned that. I'm very happy about this good news. Back in 2005, I had the opportunity of leading a Chinese delegation to visit some European countries with a view to learning about the EU's GI system. And since then, China has gradually established our own system, which enabled the two sides to cooperate in this area. Also last week, our leaders reaffirmed the commitment to wrap up the negotiations of bilateral investment treaty within this year. With that, our cooperation will enter to a new stage for sure. In addition, the two sides agreed to start high-level dialogues on climate, environment, and digital cooperation. This development represents the positive element in our bilateral relations. We should make best use of it and maintain the positive momentum. Of course, we can't deny the difference between China and the EU. For instance, China can't agree with the EU's assessment that the current crisis of WTO roots in the lack of rules to address distortions by so-called non-market policies and practice. It is a misconception which could possibly lead the WTO reform to a wrong direction and further divide its members. Rather, the root cause of today's crisis is obviously the unilateralism, protectionism, and trade bullying, which undermines the rule-based multilateral trading system and jeopardize the authority and the credibility of the WTO. At the same time, we are concerned that the EU's trade policy is moving towards a defensive path, including frequent applications of trade remedy measures, the introduction of harsh regulations to screen foreign investment, and the discrimination against the state-owned enterprises. China is willing to address the concerns of both sides through dialogue and cooperation. Lastly, generally speaking, I'm an optimist, especially when talking about the future. During the Doha round negotiation, I remembered the former WTO Director General, Mr. Pascal Lamy, often said that waiting is the killer. Based on my understanding, is to push everyone working together to advance the negotiations. However, at certain critical junctures, waiting is not entirely negative for issues beyond our capacity. Therefore, what we need now is to do what we can and wait patiently for the positive changes to come. Jacques, I promise you know what I mean. I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Maybe you mean waiting only 7 weeks? Is that what you have in mind? Or perhaps waiting much longer than 7 weeks?
Let's wait and see.
No, not that I know the result, but it's an interesting question to ask, isn't it? Because it is likely to make at least some difference. But because you spoke quite strongly. There is Mary Lovely. I recognize you immediately, although we have never met, but you're all over the place. So most welcome. And my compliments, you got up early and in time. Can I give you the floor for now, for 14 minutes?
Yes, please. Well, first, let me say it's an honor to be here. It's early morning here. As you can see, the sun has just come up in Syracuse. Yes, we do have sun in Syracuse. I greatly enjoyed listening to the excellent presentations by Professor Tu and Professor Hu. And the very clear statement made by Ambassador Zhang, who has appeared recently with my friend Annabelle Gonzalez on Trade Winds, where he also made some very cogent and useful points, which I am now using in my Chinese economy class. So thank you for spending time with Annabelle and for being such a strong voice for multilateralism. I think it's clear in listening to the presentations that a lot of hard work, and I do mean hard work, is being done by the EU and China to create real dialogue. This is not an easy task, and it's done by actual people who give their time and their intelligence to make it happen. I think sometimes we forget about that. Or at least the public seems not to realize how much work goes into these attempts to bridge gaps and to overcome real technical barriers to greater cooperation. And this is to be cheered and congratulated. And I found that message came through clearly in the presentations. It was also clear that the US is the elephant in the room, or shall we say not in the room, but the elephant nonetheless that's missing from the discussion. And I think it's partly my job to bring the US into the discussion a bit and to raise the question about how we can reduce trade tensions and address new issues. In particular, by seeking a new footing for the global trading system. I don't have a lot of answers to this. This is an ongoing set of questions that we're all working on. I think that I am going to instead issue, in some sense, a word of caution or a request for some humility on the part of the trade community in what we are able to promise and deliver. So the US has chosen a unilateral approach, despite its Ambassador Lighthizer protestations to the contrary. In part, I think because it believes that US quite simply doesn't have a stomach for the fight. That's the view from over here. Not a particularly attractive one, I admit. It seems on the other side of the Atlantic that perhaps a trade war with China, or for Europe, it would be a trade war with its third largest export market, is not the most promising avenue to prosperity. And instead that it would be better to work through existing structures, particularly the WTO, to work with China to address issues that the West has with state subsidies and other forms of state intervention in the economy. These differences in approach and emphasis mask many shared concerns of the EU and the US about China's development path since its accession to the WTO in 2001. Both the US and Europe have suffered from Chinese overcapacity, an issue that we have dealt with in a dialogue with China over time. Both believe that technology has been appropriated by the Chinese state from its most innovative companies, both operating inside China and at home. And both the EU and the US have been compelled to respond to what they see as unfair state subsidies with measures to combat these subsidies in their own markets. Each has recently expanded its review of inward foreign investment on national security grounds. And this is, I think, a cleared response by both countries to fears of Chinese technology acquisitions. So I think it's fair to say that there are real issues here that we have to acknowledge, and that many of these issues are shared by the EU and by the United States. Analysts have long argued that trade and investment practices that both the US and Europe find objectionable are more likely to be addressed by the Chinese leadership if the two regions work together. Clearly, there would be much to be gained by a clear statement by the US and China of the practices to which they object, a clear line drawn between these practices and agreements or norms that the West believes China has violated, and a unified strategy for working with China to address these concerns. I mean, one frustration that I have had simply as an academic looking at the current US-China trade war is that the US seems quite insistent that it has clearly laid out the issues. And yet I think that a serious reading of the US 301 report shows that this is not the case, that much more work needs to be done to articulate the problems that we see, how we see China has violated these agreements, and then working with China to remedy them. In other words, I see a lot of work still to be done in the EU and in the US to really be ready to work with China to address these issues. Now, why hasn't such joint action happened? I think it would be easy to lay the blame for lack of joint action on the ineptitude and belligerence of the Trump administration. The US administration has clearly ignored EU actions to confront China where it feels it needs to. And the US has actively worked against cooperation at the WTO and elsewhere. So it's clear that this view of the US as the obstacle has some merit. But I think this view lets Europe off the hook too easily. Has the EU done what it can to articulate a vision for a world in which democratic market economies can coexist peacefully with a socialist market economy the size of China? I think that it's clear that the European Commission thinks that it has not. And for evidence of that, I offer the recent request for public comment on the European Commission's strategy of open strategic autonomy, a move that I welcome and feel and hope that the European citizens will engage in vigorously, since it's much needed for the world as a whole. While the EU is ready to address the challenges of both US unilateralism and China's development strategies, I'm afraid that the Commission clearly places trade policy at the service of a large number of non-trade objectives, many of which will be discussed at this conference. These objectives include raising labor standards, furthering the effort to combat climate change, and improving the distribution of income and raising labor force participation. These are all laudable goals, ones that I think every country seeks to harness. However, I think there's dangers, a big danger here, that using trade policy for so many different objectives, even with many potential instruments, tariffs, quotas, regulation, harmonization, etc. Trade policy, in my view, is being asked to do too much. I think there's a real difference that citizens will be promised too much and delivered too little, and that this will lead to further skepticism and erosion of support for deeper integration. Perhaps this is just an American perspective. Americans who care about the world, and I put myself in that category, see the dangers of overpromising and under-delivering in the policies of the Trump administration, which promised that China would pay for the tariffs only to find out that it was Americans who were paying the tariffs. That's just one example among many. We could spend an entire session just on this topic. We also see, albeit in a less noxious form, the same impulse in the Biden campaign, which promises to buy American, yet prioritize working with allies. So these internal contradictions and confusions abound. I'm not trying to argue that the two campaigns are equivalent in their views on trade. I think that this is not the case, but I see in each campaign a way, the use of trade policy in a way that I believe cannot actually deliver for citizens. And I fear that this is something which has already come back to haunt us in the case of NAFTA and perhaps in the formation of the WTO. I think we are all pretty aware of why trade policy can't meet all these policy objectives at once. Trade policy does alter relative prices, but it only alters some prices. Much of the activity in advanced economies is not traded, and yet it contributes greatly to the problems of inequality, climate change, etc. For example, much air pollution is created simply by commuting to work, not by the production of tradables. So how can higher or lower trade barriers have much effect on it? There's a limit to what trade policy would do. The danger of big expanded promises, like we see in the Commission's statement, or at least the offering of such promises, is that other remedies will be underutilized. Non-trade problems will grow worse, and trade policy will have judged to have failed. And let me say that again. I think other remedies will be underutilized. As Ambassador Zhang noted, our economies are suffering from problems that need to be addressed by other means. And by promising that trade alone can do this, we focus all the emphasis on the external sector, on the other, as the cause of our problems and their solutions. And I think that this can have a very negative effect moving forward. Trade policy has to be focused on the essential challenge, which is creating common commercial rules and customs, which is the necessary infrastructure of global markets. To move forward in creating new regimes for digital trade, climate policy alignment, which we know border taxes are going to be an important part of that, and rules for foreign investment. Policy formation is also going to have to satisfy citizens' demands for trade that they see as fair and beneficial. It is obvious to all of us that distributional concerns must be addressed in all of our countries, especially in the US and in China, which has very high levels of inequality. Almost the same Gini for coefficient for each economy. And these have to be addressed before much progress is going to be made before further market opening. I think it's unwise to think that, at least in the United States, that there will be enough political support for further market opening unless we have serious approaches that people think are reliable to dealing with these issues of inequality. Unfortunately, it's clear to us as trade policy analysts that trade policy is unsuited to the task of redistribution. Rising inequality in the US and in China is due to forces that are more powerful than trade. European experience is a useful guide here for both of our countries, as many EU countries were subject to the same globalization forces, but did not experience the same increase in inequality. Clearly, other governmental policies are key in managing inequality and market forces that cause inequality. We trade folks would be wise to keep these limits of trade policy in the front and center. I will move toward closing by asking whether the US trade conflict is inevitable and must it continue until the world is forced to choose sides. I think sometimes it seems inevitable. But I think we have to look at the historical record over the last 20 years and realize that there were forces that brought this to a head, that in some sense that the fireplace was waiting for Mr. Trump's match to light it. Within China as well, the need for continued growth, despite an aging, shrinking labor force and an increasingly constricted political space, provides room for slow walking accession commitments and taking technology transfer shortcuts. So it's not just the US, I think, that is reaching an historical turning point. It's also true in China. Perhaps the Chinese have been more forthcoming in that than we have. I would argue that conflict is not the only path ahead of us, but I don't have a magic road to get us to way to get us to the higher road. Clearly, until the US returns to the global community, I think it's useful for us simply to remind our governments and our citizens how costly a decoupling of the world's two largest economies would be for everyone. There are enormous welfare costs associated with the splinter net already. And now you're contemplating the waste and inefficiencies of a world with quote unquote 2 sets of pipes. Trade professionals can usefully point out that the costs of attempting to isolate one side or the other have not even been fully envisioned. The EU certainly has a crucial role to play, as it has since 2016 under duress, in restoring the rules-based trading system and in prodding the US to play a more constructive role in reforming the WTO. Despite its important efforts, however, it is clear that maintaining openness is fraught with challenges, even for a champion like the EU. WTO members are keen to protect their citizens from unfair trade balances while preserving access to foreign markets. In the months to come, as many of us begin to recover from COVID-19, especially here in the United States, we will be forced to make many small and some very large decisions about where and how to be less open. We will, of course, continue to use traditional instruments, safeguards, anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, but we will also be pressed to use trade policy to revive insufficient aggregate demand, that is to get the economy restarted, to respond to complex national security claims, and to advance protections for labor and environment. If you read the Biden's campaign statements, I think you'll see that the influence of COVID-19 on trade policy is already highly evident. Openness with values at a time of much less than full employment will soon be upon us, and will force us to decide not how to move forward with openness, but how and when to become closed. So in closing, let me say that the research that's being done at RESPECT is highly valued. While I fear that the world has little patience right now for new detailed proposals on changing WTO procedures, I think that this work is vitally important. Unfortunately, we're waiting for domestic policies that will allow the world to catch up with the fine work that you're doing, and hopefully put it to good use in building better institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. You certainly had a number of very, let me call it, interesting remarks, but some were pretty stark and helpful. The chair has a problem, and therefore you all have a problem. We have only about 20 minutes left, or Bernard has a problem. That's also possible. So what I would like to do first, and then see whether we can also have some debate amongst us. There have been 3 questions asked by participants outside our panel group, and then maybe we can come back to one of the things. I'm trying to see, how do I do? One is on. How do you do that? One is on privacy and cybersecurity. Read it, and maybe one of you is willing to pick it up. Privacy, cybersecurity, and intellectual property rights in the digital economy have both trade policy and non-trade policy aspects. How do the speakers see a way forward for the EU and China to make progress on developing, if not common, at least an interoperable framework? Is anybody interested in answering this a bit specific question? Yes, please, Ambassador. I don't hear him.
You should unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yes.
I think this issue is a typical 21st issue. It's not a traditional trade policy issue, but we need to address to make a response to the concerns of a business community. I think there's different ways to handle this kind of issue. For example, bilaterally, through the dialogue between China and the EU, we have the high-level meeting between China and the EU, and the working group related to intellectual property, right? We have the bilateral investment treaty negotiations, and in WTO, we have the bilateral negotiation on e-commerce. All the issues are the important topics on the table. So our objective is to strike a balance between the economic business freedom, development, technology development, and also the private right and public interest. If we can find this middle ground, I think we can address the concerns, the defensive or sensitive, and help the business to do their job. Thank you.
Okay, we have only little time, so I want to help only the second. There are totally 3 questions asked from the other participants. This one is about the panel report that the ambassador spoke about. So I read, if the US appeals the panel report in DS 543 into the void, that is in inverted commas, will China offer the US final resolution of the dispute pursuant to Article 25 of the DSU? If the US would refuse, will China directly retaliate against the US? The way it's phrased, I can only ask the ambassador to answer.
Thank you. It's legitimate for US to appeal when they lose the panel dispute settlement. The Article 25 is available to everyone for arbitration. So China is more than happy to address the issue and the framework of WTO with the United States. Thank you.
Very good. I must say I had expected that answer, but anyway, it's good to say that. I don't think there will be an appeal. Anyway, third one is this: any, emphasis on any, trade policy deliver prosperity without respecting the proposition that agreements shall be kept. In Latin, pacta sunt servanda. Consider the US reaction to the UK's breach of the Brexit withdrawal agreement. Surely the same must apply with respect to the WTO. That is the principle that must come first, isn't it? Who would want to pick that up? Maybe Weinian? Weinian, would you going to pick it up?
Actually, I would like to say a few words more on the privacy, cybersecurity, and the intellectual property rights protection. Is that okay with the chair?
First, answer this question and then maybe add a bit. So breaching agreements, that's the question, you know. How can you build on trade policy when agreements are breached? That's essentially what it says, no?
I actually personally, I don't think Johnson's proposition is a breach of the Brexit withdrawal agreement, because creativity of the court is allowed under the common law. So I don't see why the Johnson government could not do that if the circumstances no longer fit. Vis-a-vis the EU's position. And if some negotiation items will be in jeopardy,
That's
I don't see why.
Because you don't hear that position a lot. Why don't you very briefly say something about the other thing, but literally think of a minute and a half, no more.
Yeah, I will see that EU-China has a cyber task force since 2012. So they discuss about deepening understanding about trust on cyber issues. So the EU-China do address these cybersecurity issues. And also in terms of e-commerce, plurilateral e-commerce negotiations, I see that for the time being, EU's position and China's position are quite apart on a few areas, for example, on cross-border data flow. And this is also a question applicable to the internet-based payment system provided by non-bank financial suppliers. That's a question mentioned by the phase one agreement, because China's People's Bank of China requires data localization and facilities localization. And also consumers' data protection. Under the EU, that's GDPR, so personal data belongs to individuals. But on the other hand, on China's position is that that's a national security, so belongs to the country. So that's all I want to say. And there are also divergence on market access positions. and also scope of negotiations that both sides also hold different views. Thank you.
I have a question for Mary and for Xinquan. It's the same question, but maybe from different sides, or maybe you agree. In 7 weeks, it's possible, I don't know, but it's possible that Joe Biden is president of the US. And the question is, how, if at all, would that change the US-China or EU-US-China relationship? So first the lady, Professor Lovely, and then my colleague, Professor Tu.
Well, very quickly, I think it will change a lot of things. I think in particular, you're going to see Biden return to form in the sense that he will move the US again closer to Europe on many factors, many areas, renewing the transatlantic alliance. And I think that this is really the key part of his trade policy that we need to focus on. I think there could be room for a rollback in the China tariffs. There's plenty of evidence showing that they hurt the US economy. However, politically, that would be very difficult without some further negotiations with China so that the American people can believe that there has been some give and take here. But nevertheless, I still think there is room there. I don't expect to see that in the near term. We all know that he's going to inherit an economy that's in rough shape. So I think you'll see dramatic changes, and I think you'll see dramatic changes in the triad because of it.
Very good. Xinquan, do you think when Biden comes, it would not only change, of course, the US, as Mary suggests, but also China might want to make a move if that were to happen? Maybe you have to mute. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I said, I mean, in China, actually, there are some people preferring Trump to be reelected because they believe that Trump is hurting, especially U.S. soft power, and Trump is also fighting with U.S. allies. So then, if Biden got elected, then Biden could work with U.S. allies and to deal with China. So in this sense, maybe under Biden's presidency, there will be even higher pressure on China, or China could be possibly isolated, something like that. But in my own opinion, I would still believe that there could be better interaction between China and the US under Biden's presidency, because we want to deal with a civilized government. We don't want to, we don't like unilateralism. So, and also actually, as Professor Lovely said, actually, there are some issues which the US and the EU want to address with China. I mean, inside China, many people also believe that China could take more active and progressive reforms to deal with these issues. They are not necessarily against our own interest. So, you know, like right now in China, many people are talking about joining the CPTPP. So, as I said, I think we are not afraid to discuss these issues with as I said, a civilized government of the United States, or even a kind of alliance between the US and the EU. It's no problem. But we should follow the existing WTO rules. We should not use unilateral tariffs against each other.
If I may say something about this, if it were to, the second half of what you said, if the CAI would be signed and ultimately ratified, and if China would join, let's say, the Pacific Alliance, to call it simple, if that were both to happen within a year after Biden is elected, I can tell you that in Brussels, the flag goes out. That is exactly the kind of move and direction that the EU would greatly applaud. There's no doubt about this. There has been some talk in Brussels that we could also join this to get, you know, sort of a plurilateral group of, let's say, WTO-loving super regionalism, or give it a name, but that would certainly be the thing. And of course, the European dictum is, we may be tough on China or ever tougher, but no war. That's certainly, there's no question. People just don't, and business and the governments don't want a trade war. That's not the way to deal with it. So that must be very clear. We, near the end of this, I would like to ask first Ambassador, then Wei, and then the other two speakers, whether you want to have a final word of, let's say, 1.5 minutes. Ambassador first.
Thank you, Jacques. As I said, that I still optimistic about the future as China-US, China-EU trade relationship, and the foundation of the bilateral relationship is the multilateral trading system. So I'm proud of my current job, and I'm still think that it's possible for us to push forward the WTO reform and find convergence among the big players with other WTO members. Thank you.
Pleasure. Weinian.
Muted. You're muted.
I would like to say that China should continue its reform process because I see that lots of issues troubling trade, external trade relations actually go back to China's commitment in terms of SOE, in terms of industrial subsidies, and in terms of subsidy reporting transparency. And also on forced technology transfer, because in the accession protocol and the working report, China agreed to not use this barter treatment in order to have this exercise of market for technology. But so far, it's still going on. That's why I say if China could continue its reform process more vigorously, and lots of trade tensions could be mitigated or solved. Thank you.
Mary?
Well, I agree with Dr. Hu. If China continues its reform process, it certainly will help. But I also see and I emphasize the need for the US to restore its own domestic situation. And I am thankful that the rest of the world has continued to make progress and is in some sense borne with us through this period of difficulty. And I hope they'll continue to support us as we do the hard work of coming out of the COVID crisis, which, as you all know, has hit the US economy incredibly hard. So thank you all for your work. Bear with us, and hopefully we will meet again in the future with a more united front and perhaps more progress to report. Thanks.
Did you want to?
Okay, I think the West, maybe, or the US and EU should have more goodwills and more understandings about China's strategic intentions. I think there are too many skepticism or doubts about that. Actually, I believe that the Chinese government, I think the Chinese government, wants to focus on the own development for our people. But you know, Chinese people are not so good at expression. You know, I think there is a big problem in terms of translation or translation of our policies to the outside world. So I believe that there are still a lot of misunderstanding about China's strategic intention. So so of course, I think if we can have more very good spokesman for China, like Ambassador Zhang, I think there will be a more mutual understandings between China and especially the West. Then I think then on the basis of this mutual understanding, then these technical issues are not so easy to solve. I believe that China's so-called socialist market economy and the Western market economy have a lot of common things. So anyway, I hope so.
Thank you. I have to draw this to a close. And I think we covered quite a lot amazingly in 1.5 hours. I wanted to say 2 small additional things. So I'm not going to repeat or summarize everything, but on 2 things, which is perhaps more from the EUN, but maybe not totally. One is on the overburdening of trade policy, what Mary emphasized. I couldn't agree more, but the fact that I agree, or maybe some of us agree, doesn't necessarily mean that Brussels, quote, agrees. We have given too many opportunities, also in law and in rights and in committees, to overburdening trade policy. You probably, Mary, but many of us will regularly look at the trade newsletter of the Commission. And if you look at that on a regular basis, the part that is debated for NGOs and the civil community, so these are things of that kind, is much more important than the essential trade parts that are communicated. And this is not once or twice, this is the whole year. That gives you a somewhat imperfect indication that trade policy is powerful, or it's certainly perceived as powerful. So the tree is hung with heavy fruit until the branches break. The second point is on dialogues. We say a lot about the dialogue. And Hu and I look systematically at the over 50 economic dialogues that the EU has with China. And we can say a lot to Professor Tu. I think nobody before us has done so much effort to try to understand these dialogues and what they bring. A lot of it is not public, so it's very hard to get people to talk. And in all fairness, it's harder to get the Chinese officials to talk than the EU officials to talk. So it's very difficult to get a balanced, good picture. And we will pursue and go on because Xinquan is right. We have to understand each other well as a basis for going on. Can I thank you all very much for your contributions, and we will persevere.
Thank you, Jacques. Thank you.
Bernard?
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Bernard. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
张老师再见哈，
Yeah，再见。
再见，胡老师。
啊，太客气了，再见，很高兴见到你。
是。
OK。